The Levy Oration. The Levy Oration was set up in 2012 in honour of one of the early pioneers of grassland science and one of the founders of this Grasslands Association, Sir Bruce Levy. Sir Bruce worked for 40 years promoting the use of superphosphate, growing the most productive grasses, and focusing on the soil-plant complex until he retired in 1951. This award, presented in his honour, allows the recipient to speak on a topic of their choosing. It takes me great pleasure to award this year's Levy Oration to Robyn Dynes. Robyn is a farming systems scientist with Ag Research based at Lincoln. Her science in farming systems includes emissions to air and water and the current and future challenges facing our farming systems. She has governance roles across arable, sheep and beef and dairy sectors. She spent her early years in Southland on a sheep and beef farm, followed by a Canterbury mixed cropping farm. She started her science career with CSIR in Western Australia before returning to Ag Research. Her passion is working with farmers to bring science to the questions that matter to farmers. Robyn. Congratulations.
It's a real honour to deliver this year's Levy Oration. Thank you for the privilege and the stress. Sir Bruce was a leader, scientist and communicator. It's true to say his research was the foundation that underpins our grassland systems. As I reflected on this oration in my panic mode and thought of my role as a farm systems scientist, connector and communicator, I kept coming back to the importance of context and of the key principles of our biological systems. Levy's impact during his career was not only the excellence of his science, but also that he understood its context within the farm gate, with the farmers, with regions nationally and internationally. And it was easy to think it was an easier time, and a more straightforward task to extend his science. However, his research and leadership were within a nation coming through the Great Depression, World War II, global food rationing, and the loss and maiming of 2 generations of young men. So in this context, one can see where his belief that producing food for the world was New Zealand's proper role and duty came from. And his approach, described as a sergeant major dressing down the latest batch of new recruits, fitted the context of the time. Context is the essential backdrop which shapes meaning, interpretation, and the relevance of information. And things have a different meaning with context. For example, those of us traumatised by the interest rates of the 1980s don't think 8% interest is so very high. But in the context of the price of houses, the context is very different. By seeking to understand context, we can better understand the actions of others. Now, I propose that as the external drivers change and increase, our impact and our perceived value in research and extension are all centred on our context. In this post-truth era, the context is indeed complex. Let's consider the pervasive power of social media, the power of the algorithm to entrench views, facilitate radical advocacy, build new movement and create change. It's a power for good too. From podcasts to postings, it's a channel for sharing knowledge, for extension, for sharing our story with our customers. However, let's as scientists foster trust in the curious, healthy scepticism. It's inherent in our science processes and probably a critical element to protect against misinformation. It still holds that if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. My farming grandparents were of the Levy era. Levy and his colleagues brought the grasslands technology to the pioneering principles and there was massive growth in productivity in the 20s and 30s. Yet, productivity did not protect us from a slump in demand for our products in the 1930s. And this was the time when my paternal grandparents walked off their sheep and beef farm. At the same time, my brother-in-law's grandparents kept their farm because PGG backed them. That was an action that has led to multi-generational loyalty to that company. The post-World War II government was preoccupied with export earnings, and agriculture growth was seen as a real saviour for the country. The UK dominated our market, GATT and the WTO were our protectors. Productivity and demand aligned. So let's roll into the 1960s and my era. My life and career has traversed at least 3 phases for this sector. This has been an era of global stability post-World War II, one which has delivered so many benefits for New Zealand. The key principles of the biological systems remain constant. And across these 3 phases, in my time, our knowledge and tools have built much greater understanding of these foundations. And I stand on the shoulders of so many giants, of the science, of their research and their wisdom. This phase, from 1960 to 1984, Richard Leheron, in the Journal of Rural Studies, described as a state-led expansion phase. There's many in this room who know much more of it than I do. My parents, Cliff and Alvina, their pathway to farming started with a small herd of cows and working part-time, and they delivered milk to Wyndham. Their step to full-time farming was to Fairfax in 1962 to a sheep and beef farm, again with a small herd of cows. And they had a cream check every week. I arrived on the scene a couple of years later. This was a huge opportunity time for young farmers in New Zealand, and within 5 years they were able to move to 200 hectares of rolling sheep country 20 kilometres north of Gore. Now this was driven by their neighbours at Fairfax wanting to provide for the next generation and being prepared to pay well over the value of the land to acquire the neighbouring farm. Pukeroa was a strong community of farmers. Cliff became the secretary of the Federated Farmers. They were wrestling with the big issues in 1970, whether the meat board was doing enough for the value of lamb, and concerned that the vets were making too much money out of drench. There was an abundance of government support, from advice to the rabbit board to the dog dosing strip. I commend Levy's 1950 paper at our grasslands conference in Invercargill on some aspects of grassland farming in Southland. It was a comprehensive systems approach. He talked about what the farmers were focusing on and what they should be focusing on, through to quality nutrition for high-producing ewes. And he stated the obvious need for forages or root crops in Southland's climate. Yet less than 20 years later, my father was advised to go to all-grass wintering, which we did for a couple of years and several massive snowstorms, and we were back to the trusty Swedes. This coincided with me being a very busy preschooler. I went everywhere with Cliff, very safe, on the tray on the back of Fergie. The key principles of this decade, where am I meant to be pointing this? Thank you. This was a significant decade with the paper of Blackster and Clapperton's meta-analysis on methane emissions in sheep and cattle on different forage types. They rewrote the previous notion of methane emissions. And just have a look at the citations of this 1965 paper and how relevant it is today. Our farming journey was changed overnight in 1970 with the sudden death of my mother, leaving Cliff raising 3 small, perfect angels, servicing a large mortgage, and it wasn't for the faint-hearted. So my formative years were raised by a man with a binder twine in his pocket, plenty of number 8 wire, a can-do world with few boundaries, and experiential learning was at the centre of what we did. The state-led expansion of agriculture was starting to get the wobbles. More and more support came from the government, and our position was crumbling with the UK move to the EU. Late in the 1970s was our new beginnings. Our newly banded family moved to mid-Canterbury to a small mixed cropping farm. Cliff's promise was that Thompson's Track would have no more mud. It was a swap from stock work to mixed cropping to the Alice Chalmers header, a 6-foot sickle mowers, more horses, and the power of the nor'west. It was closing in on the end of the Muldoon era, and the key principles of essential to high-performing livestock that Levy had espoused had not changed. Yet, we continued to drive our sheep numbers up. Lahiran contended that the decision to focus on increased export earnings turned uncritically to the physical rather than the economic potential of a well-performing sector. It was all about volume, and we all know the consequences. This, of course, led to the infamous election in 1984, precipitating change at a rate that we had not seen previously. This hit us hard, with foreclosures, consolidation, and heartache. And many of you, I know, like me, will see the scars remain in our families from that early stage. This productivity phase of New Zealand emerged at this time as a part of our survival and growth. Well, this was unfolding. Sorry. Could we go back to, please? I was studying at Lincoln University. In Lincoln College, in the 1980s. We'd just lost my stepmother to cancer. The top twins were playing orientation, and John Minto attempted to speak. It was too far to the left for the average Lincoln student, Professor Moot exempt, because the average was a rugby-playing, farm-reared white male. Agricultural science was a fabulous degree built on the foundations of the biological systems. Within an agricultural context, our field trips were legendary, and Prof White always had a spade. It was a difficult time for the New Zealand economy, and females were still the minority, trying to break into agriculture on the ground. But as a well-connected farming female, my practical work requirements were pretty easy to meet. My favourite, Graham Robertson. He took on the neighbouring girl. He was a top bloke, a top boss, and brave to take me on, according to the other neighbours. From nodding thistles to sickle mowers and lunchtime debate, those summers were stunning. The crazy was my uncle's friend. He was a dairy farmer just out of Invercargill. He trained me for 10 days and then left me in sole charge of his town supply herd for 2 months. Well, my urban female classmates had a really crap time. It was a different time and not an easy time for many females. My first job post-graduation was a nutritionist for a feed company, Poultrymen's Cooperative in Auckland. They were egg and boiler producers. For me, it was the crash course where science meets commercial realities, and it all was based on the least cost modelling, which was my job, along with the courageous conversation when the phones rang. Why do we use antibiotics? We didn't. Why do you house hens in cages? We do. But the lure of pastoral farming was strong for me, so I returned to Lincoln to complete a PhD on gastrointestinal parasites. My arrival coincided with the share market crash of 1987, another period of economic turmoil. Graham Burrell once said, "It'll all be good. When you finish your PhD, jobs will abound." They weren't. I did, however, marry John at this point. Wisely, his ag degree had taken him to technology and IBM, so it was an economically wise move on my part. Plus, he spent his weekends shoveling sheep shit at the JML laboratory with the Dennis Poppy designed cages. This was a great foundation for what's been a long marriage. My studies included models of feed intake and ruminants, and I look back on this as a major learning phase. I had a dynamic supervisor department and an engaged postgraduate community, where practical, philosophical and life lessons abound. Please ask Dawn Daly about how we euthanased our first sheep one Sunday morning, and how I still bear the scars of her handpiece, Oration. Dynes instilled the value of global networks. So Dawn, myself and others took Professor Maggie Gill from the Macaulay out for breakfast at Strawberry Fair. That payback has been in every single decade of my career. The late Hugh Dove, we had an infamous road trip back from NZSAP in Wellington, crammed into a small student car with the large personality that was Hugh. I closed out my PhD. The context for New Zealand was shifting rapidly, moving to this productivity phase for agriculture, but the economic realities were still grim. And thankfully, John and I were happy to head off overseas, where I was offered a role in Western Australia with CSIRO as an animal scientist. CSIRO was trying to realign their science activity to match production across Australia, and WA was the powerhouse of production, and no one from Sydney wanted to live in Perth, which was my opportunity. CSIRO was a great place to work. The diversity of what it does shown here in their current top 10 achievements. Hugh Dove, on the back of that road trip, opened doors, became a true friend. He shared his wisdom readily and was the only person who got away with calling me Mother Dynes when my parenting phase arrived. That plastic money in number 2, that cost livestock industries 10 jobs. CSIRO self-insured, we never found out the truth, but it went something like this. The scientists may have tried to sell the picogram twice. For that we were taken to court, and for that we lost 10 jobs. CSIRO, with its federal funding, was independent of state politics and pressures, and in contentious areas could continue to put the hard science on the table with the challenging questions. I was gifted the mentorship of Bob Weston. His 15 papers on the factors limiting intake of feed by sheep are a masterclass in experimental design, and they build on all the foundational knowledge of the past. His mantra was, Robyn, remember those key principles, because the apparent difference in many trials comes down to the diet quality and quantity, which we could have predicted on the back of an envelope and not done the trials. I did, however, arrive in 1991, the same year the reserve price ended for wool. Production crashed along with our revenue. And scale took a whole new meaning in WA. Finding 2 new research sites took 1,500 kilometres over 2 days, and we thought nothing of a 3.5-hour one-way trip to weigh a mob of sheep. We welcomed our 3 kids in Perth to a life of endless beaches, long summers, no puddles and plenty of sand. And as my responsibilities grew, the tyranny of distance, with a 2-day meeting in Adelaide being a good week of your time. Back to those giants. You need wisdom in your science for a number of reasons. Jenny Brand Miller, the author of The Low GI Diet and Forefront of Knowledge, she was the one, when I was pregnant, obviously pregnant at a dinner at a conference, said to me, Robyn, you can have it all. You can be a mother and a scientist. Be positive about that. Never feel guilty, never apologise, and it's absolutely fine to leave the kids in economy when you go into business class. I've tried that, it worked. They weren't so happy. The late Peter Hartman. Do you know, even today, that breastfeeding instructions are not evidence-based? So Peter gave me a lecture on the evidence base of breastfeeding. He subsequently myth-busted every comment I made about whether my water intake was linked to milk production, foreign high milk production, supply and demand. So to this day, I actually think I'm a bit of an expert on the physiology of breastfeeding. And context was everything in Australia. It has 2 levels of government, and that impacts on a lot. It's also got the Murray-Darling Basin river system, which is politically so important. Its mineral wealth is huge, and that changes the place for agriculture. Added to that, the Mediterranean climate, extensive cropping systems. I was on a big learning curve. At the centre of that was strategic research on the plant-animal interface. And we took that And we partnered with Gilmac, Australia's largest oat and hay exporter. Of course, Peter from Gilmac went to school with my boss, so that always helped. But what we did was we've developed algorithms for nutritive value in oat and hay. Overnight, Gilmac set a new standard for objective assessment, and they immediately got a $20 a tonne premium for their product into Japan. Today, they export just on 1 million tonnes into that market. So our science and our algorithms set them on a pathway that no one could beat. Back to those key principles. If you honestly think ME of 11.9 is different to 12.2, please go and read Gary Waghorn's paper from our 2007 conference and talk to Ronaldo Vibard about why that's not true. Secondary salinity was emerging in the 1990s as a massive political challenge, a hot potato. It's an issue impacting agriculture, infrastructure, biodiversity and water resources. And it was particularly politically important because the Murray-Darling feeds Adelaide's water. We did a lot of brainstorming on what the future could look like. And for agricultural landscapes at scale, the only real option is livestock grazing, if we could get perennial systems in place. This was my first leadership of a genuinely transdisciplinary research program. Our strategic research started on the impact of salinity on the animal. Warren King and his colleagues in the East needed sorting out, and we were the ones to do it. By the early 2000s, I had $3 million of research revenue that I was managing across Australia. The Annamieka saltbush, which came out of that program in about 6 years ago, is named after one of those 2 farms from our 1,500-kilometre road trip. In its first 5 years, 3,000 hectares have been planted across 200 farms. WA was really hard to leave, but the lessons remain. I experienced a very different context where politics and urban pressures were both constraint and opportunity, where the power brokers were really distant, the farmers different but the same. The CRC model was such a powerful model for science. I returned to New Zealand with these learnings on board, with a clear understanding that urban dwellers, environmental drivers, local and global political forces were changing the context of farming far faster than we could appreciate. Lester Fletcher, Tom Fraser, Greg Lambert and Gavin Sheath tried to keep me on the right path. And I was back to my farming roots, so finding farmers to work with was easy. And back to my brother-in-law, who I mentioned earlier. It's fair to this day, I keep him grounded, not too far right, and he keeps me grounded in the practicalities. The early 2000s, when I arrived back, dairying was still expanding rapidly in Canterbury, and I think it was the silent arrival of our third phase. This constrained balance between environment and productivity that we're still battling with. I could see my colleagues were leaning in to both water quality issues and climate change, and yet I felt the farmers' context was so deeply embedded in productivity. That brother-in-law, I pissed him off big time when I said, there is no way border dike irrigation can last. The day he rang me to tell me that they'd just invested in spray irrigation, he was pretty unhappy. And then he argued, we will never do dairy support on our arable farm. Guess what underpins their arable farm today? Guess who his best friends are? So agriculture in New Zealand, my gig has been very much in farm systems, working with social scientists, systems modellers, environmental and some animal scientists, mostly in the context of emissions to air and water. Our first foray into the mid-2000s with farmer groups where we got them to design farms of the future and we modelled them with them certainly required a thick skin. But we were where we needed to be with our eyes on and beyond the horizon. The work we're doing now to understand the science required for the future, we're down in the weeds, but we're where we need to be with the right context and key principles at our centre. So I see our context as this. We are in this constrained, optimised phase, and yet things are changing rapidly. Our golden era as an exporting nation is behind us. The world does not need us. We need them to want us and to choose us. The protection of the WTO has passed. The free trade agreements are our future, and we will have to protect them with court cases. And that means we too must be doing the right thing. Our ambitions for environmental bottom line have no simple fix. A future with less livestock needs markets and capital, and a lot of both of those. The farmer view of transformation is different to what Wellington thinks transformation is. Are we listening enough to our farmers? And are we delivering the science our farmers need now and for the future? The external pressures on farming are fascinating as we look right now how the pressures have shifted from the government to that of our customers. Grasslands are front and centre and will continue to be. We can double forestry, arable and horticulture and still have 8 million hectares of grasslands. So in those past few years, when I've been in some courageous conversations, panel discussions, my messages have been grounded in the pragmatism of it all. The farmer questions that for the last 20 years in New Zealand I have addressed haven't changed, and we've got to be consistent in our science on these. They say, why don't we get a credit for the carbon we grow in pasture? Why don't we get a credit for soil carbon, because it's definitely increasing? We're already the most efficient farmers in the world, so why tax us? The world needs our food, so why should we bother? Methane's not a problem. New Zealand's contribution is so small, it doesn't matter. Regenerative agriculture is better, or it's not. I think we've got our heads in the sand over the climate goals of our customers and how fast they're changing, on whether we're really capturing the benefit from our genetics of our plants and our animals, how to avoid resistance to anthelmintics, herbicides, and what comes next, and the global drivers of choice. So we need to celebrate and acknowledge what we've achieved in the past, to value and trust our R&D, to build new knowledge, and to remember the importance of systems. We've done great work in Whiri Ora to bring together data and knowledge to help with the decisions for the future. So for me, building a science career has not been a particularly easy journey. I've pivoted and pivoted to survive and thrive. I once lost a 500 kilo cow, Angus heifer, in Claremont, the top suburb in Perth. She was from the station country. She wasn't happy. Thankfully, she got to the Claremont railway station, didn't know how to buy a ticket, and the police kindly brought her back. I also had a research thread that saw me on a top-rating children's television show in Australia for my composting earthworms. I mean, really? Farm and life events have fostered in me deep pragmatism. John came with my Lincoln degree, and together we've built a solid foundation. We've 3 Aussie kids who are healthy skeptics and deeply pragmatic adults. Today I have an incurable disease. So I am living, so I choose to live. It's a crazy context, one where Farm Act decisions matter like hell. We're squeezing every moment out of life matters the most. My response is my own, to choose. And I'm choosing to make the best of today. I'm choosing to be an inspiration to myself. So please, don't offer me cheap wine or crap steak, because my life is genuinely too short. I want a future where we attract, grow and enthuse budding scientists who thrive and build impactful careers. A future where my daughter and you fabulous young women in the sector get pay equity without the crap. Levy was part of building a strong foundation from our pastoral sector. Nearly 100 years later, nothing has changed. Nor have the challenges of the shocking spring in Southland or the long drought in the Huranui. But the world has changed. Today we live in a complex world and a busy one with ever-increasing clamour. Our science is a key to the challenges and the opportunities, but it alone is not the solution. We need to take heed of the context. Let's not be naive, nor choose to blame others. and always be healthy sceptics. Our international markets tell us what they expect and what they want. We have a choice, yet we sort of don't. We have a unique pastoral advantage. Let's be courageous with our science, innovative with our farming, and stronger together. Because at the end, folks, it's all about context. Thank you.